Church of the Covenant, it is truly such an honor and a delight to be back at home with all of you this morning. This community, your faces, your stories, our shared memories, they are in my heart and my mind every single day. And as I have the privilege of standing back again in this familiar sanctuary, I want to start by simply letting each of you know what a special and transformative community this covenant grotto of God truly is. And so turning now to our text and our time of reflection together, I invite you to pray with me. God of our daylight and God of our caves, we thank you for the rituals, the stories, the traditions, and the communities that bring us closer to you. In this shared time together, may we hear your voice and your nudging as we sink and as we rise. Amen. 3 years ago, I bid farewell to a church community I deeply loved. You may have heard of it, and began a new position as the Director of Spiritual and Religious Life at Emerson College, as Rob said, right across the Boston Garden and the Boston Common. And upon arrival, I quickly learned something that I found to be at once a little jarring, a little intriguing, maybe even a little comical, which was that as the Director of Spiritual Life, I felt as though everyone expected me to be the campus's ultimate meditation expert, a beacon of stillness, of calm, of quiet, a bearer of deep wisdom, with a long-studied practice of mindfulness that I was eager to bring to the entire community. Now, for those of you who know me, you might not be surprised to know that I'm not really that. I have to admit, on the contrary, I've always identified myself as more of the person to get you pumped up, dancing, singing, clapping, not to quiet us down. And so, in those early days at Emerson, I had a decision I needed to make. Would I embrace this new challenge? Or would I just keep telling people, nope, not me, sorry, nope, that's not me? Eventually, I came to realize that maybe God was nudging me to stretch. Perhaps I could use a dose of that stillness, a dose of that quiet that this campus community was so clearly calling me towards. And so I began to dive in. And a couple of years ago, I came across an account of meditation that truly piqued my interest. It was found in a book that I'm wondering if anyone has read called Untamed by Glennon Doyle. Is it a familiar book? I know Alyssa has read it. All right, well, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's a book filled with brief personal vignettes of the author's experiences of understanding ways in which she had felt tamed by the outside world and how she slowly but surely began to trust her real self and unleash that taming that she had experienced. And in one of the stories, she tells us of this messy, beautiful practice where each morning she would get her kids off to school and she'd crawl into her bedroom closet. There in her closet, she would sit on a towel and, she tells us, surrounded by dirty t-shirts and scattered shoes, she'd practice what she calls the sinking. 10 minutes a day, sitting on the floor of her closet doing nothing but breathing. And at first, she described this as the worst ever. But eventually, there, in the darkness of that closet, inside that imperfect bedroom grotto, something began to happen. And Doyle writes, eventually, I sank deep enough to find a new level inside me that I'd never known existed. This place is underneath, low, deep, quiet, still. There are no voices there, not even my own. All I can hear down there is my breath. It was as though I'd been drowning, and in my panic, I had been gasping for air, calling for rescue, flailing on the surface. But what I really needed to do to save myself was to let myself sink, to crawl into that cave and to let herself sink. And there in that cave, she recounts, sinking into the stillness, a sense of knowing would greet her there. A sense of knowing that would nudge her gently to the next right thing. A sense of knowing sunken down in her cave that would allow her again to rise. For it was only in the sinking that she began to know the rising. And so I've been asking myself, could this be a helpful image for meditation? To enter that cave and to let ourselves sink, to listen to a stillness within that perhaps we didn't even know was there. I cannot say that 3 years later, I now claim to have any answers about meditation than I did before. But I have begun to see how so many of our sacred stories, so many of our liturgical traditions point us right towards those grottos, point us right towards those bedroom closets, those places of stillness, and to see if by sinking we learn how to rise. And so, with those images in mind, I came to this morning's story from 1 Samuel, a story which so beautifully illustrates the profound spiritual transformation or metanoia that can happen when we sink deep down into the innermost parts of our caves. This story this morning was a long one, and Abhishek, I'm grateful for you for reading it so beautifully for us. And as I've read and I've reread it, I found it useful to break it down into 3 parts. What happens before the cave, in the cave, after the cave. So the story begins before the cave, and we are in the midst of a big chase. Saul, the current yet rejected king of Israel, and 3,000 warriors are chasing David and his ragtag band. But then, the 2 of them find themselves deep in a nearby cave for different reasons. It seems David is in there hiding from Saul in the innermost parts of the cave we hear. And then, unbeknownst to him, Saul also stops in fact, to answer the call of nature, which I had never heard referred to in the Bible story before. From deep within that cave, that place of stillness and darkness, apart from the chasing and the running and the panting and the flailing, David is now presented face to face with his enemy, facing his enemy in that stillness. He first decides to cut a corner of Saul's cloak, and in a moment of transformation, he then becomes overwhelmed by regret and then clarity. David and Saul then emerge one by one out of the grotto, and the 2 encounter one another for the first time in the light of day. Now, their daylight encounter, that post-cave part of this story, is not one of violence, and nor is it one of best friends either. Of all the wounds healed, they skip off together into the sunset. No, their encounter is nothing but a good next step. A conversation rooted in respect for the other and respect for self. And in the end, David decides to send Saul, his enemy, safely away. Indeed, this is one of those sacred stories where there is something about the stillness of the cave, the wisdom of the grotto, mysteriously changing the trajectory of the story. And there is so much about this story that remains a mystery. Why did David's time in the cave lead him to change? Why did Saul's time in the cave lead him to change? What is it about those cave moments that lend themselves to transformation? The more I think about it, the more I'm coming to believe that transformations, yes, they happen in the caves, not really because of what is there, but perhaps more significantly, because of what is not there. When we think about a cave, it is stark. It is quiet, likely not abundant or full, but rather a place that is set aside from our usual chasing and fleeing of running and striving, a quiet place without our distractions, without our hustles and our busyness. When we think about how to truly get still, to truly listen, to truly sink down into our innermost knowing, perhaps it isn't about what we need to do, or what we need to add, or what we need to try, but perhaps more significantly, it's about what we need to take away, to omit, to subtract. I have found it enlightening lately to think back to the times where I have felt connected to God, perhaps because of a sense of courage that I felt, or an insight, or a feeling of groundedness, and ask myself, in that moment of connection, what was not there? In that moment of connection, what was absent? Could the holiness be found in the omissions? For me, and maybe this would be true for others as well, the answer, it happens to always involve my cell phone. No cell phone, no computer, no Instagram, no headphones, probably no calendar filled with back-to-back Zoom calls. But for me, I have found entering the cave of transformation usually is about those subtractions and not about the additions. And this power of holy subtraction, it is found in so many of our faith traditions precisely now in this season. Of course, there is Lent, this sacred season where we are invited to give something up, to release something, to subtract something in order to come closer to God. And then, yesterday, April 2nd, began the holy month of Ramadan for our Muslim siblings, a month-long practice that invites in the power of subtraction in order to connect in more fully with one's spiritual self. In Ramadan, its observance fasts from food and liquids every day from sunrise to sunset in order to transcend beyond our physical vessels and connect back in with our innermost knowing. And then, of course, the Jewish practice of Shabbat, that weekly day of rest, where rest and renewal comes largely by subtracting so many elements of daily life. For many Jews and those who observe the Sabbath, there are actually 39 categories of forbidden actions, 39 categories of what one must refrain from, must subtract in order to truly rest, to truly listen, to truly enter into the cave with God. Perhaps these grottos, these caves, these bedroom closets, they aren't limited to physical spaces, but instead represents the states of being, where we've subtracted away that which only serves to distract us, that which only leaves us chasing one thing or fleeing from another, as Saul chased David. And these caves of transformation, they are always available to us. We just need to know to release. And so this morning, I ask you and I ask me, what do you need to take away? What do you need to subtract, to release, in order to step into your cave? We may not need a grotto or a bedroom closet. We may not need a cave or a cavern. We only need the power of subtraction. The power of subtraction that allows us to sink, to listen, to face our enemies and our fears and our questions, and then in turn, to rise. Amen. I invite you to join